Hi, and welcome to Take Every Thought Captive, our weekly look at the Catholic intellectual tradition and an exploration of the authors, books, and topics that have shaped Catholic thinking for 2,000 years. My name is Jason Gill, and I'm joined this week by Dr. Benjamin Smith, our lecturer in philosophy. And today we're going to cover kind of a topic that relates to one of Dr. Smith's classes on philosophy of God that he's currently running. But we want to take we want to take a little bit different approach. But before we get into today's topic, I want to invite all of our listeners. Please hit that subscribe button. I know it's something little, but it helps us out a lot in building and growing our community here at Catholic Studies Academy. Because we really want to grow it beyond just the formal classes that we offer, but we really want to grow a community of serious Catholics who want to grow deeper in their Catholic faith and think seriously and deeply about some difficult issues with our faith, and also get back to some of the philosophical foundations that really hold up the reasons for why we have faith. We're going to cover some of that today, and the topic is going to be natural theology. But we're going to take a little bit of a different angle today with Dr. Smith. Because usually when people talk about natural theology, or it quickly gets into faith and reason, which is a great. I mean, that's our motto here at Catholic Studies Academy.
Sure.
It's a great way to go, but we want to take a little bit different approach in talking about natural theology. And that's because there's even some hesitancy among Christians and Christian theologians about natural theology, that we're setting God to our standards of reason and judging God by our standards of reason, as opposed of letting God be the standard of everything. So Dr. Smith, to get us started, maybe you can maybe just let's define our terms here in natural theology, and maybe set up the problem a little bit for us to dive into today.
Sure. Thanks, Jason. So the term natural theology, I mean, it's probably a term that, unless you're just really into philosophy and theology, you probably may not even ever heard the phrase natural theology as such. That phrase is used to distinguish a way of studying God. So it's a kind of theology, a way of studying God, thinking about God, that is natural, as distinct from supernatural. That is what's usually called, or at least among the scholastics, called sacred doctrine, right? So natural theology is a way of studying God that is philosophical in nature, right? It's rooted in the light of natural reason. Now, in a certain sense, this is actually as old as philosophy. You have Plato and the Timaeus, as well as in a couple of other texts, pushing towards the study of God. Now, as a philosopher, when we're thinking about God strictly from a philosophical perspective, we're thinking about the ultimate principle, the ultimate origin, the ultimate source, right? Is there such a thing, right? And if so, how do we know it exists? And what are its attributes, things of that nature? That's, of course, similar to what Christian theologians are doing. The God of the Bible is the ultimate source of things. But of course, we say a lot more about God from sacred scripture than we would say from a philosopher's perspective. But the two sort of subject matters are consistent with each other. They're not contradictory as much as they are distinct. Sometimes natural theology is called philosophy of God in a more contemporary setting. Like if you were to go to a Catholic seminary, you would probably take a class in philosophy of God, for example.
Or Catholic Studies Academy. We have that.
That's right. That's right.
Shameless plug.
That's right. So you're just giving people, Jason, the resources they need.
That's right.
But so this is a study of God that proceeds along the lines of the light of reason. Now, a lot of Christians have historically endorsed this idea. That is that alongside of studying God and trying to understand God in the light of sacred scripture, we can also try to study God and understand God in the light of reason. Sometimes this is given, I think, a wrong picture. It's what I would
Sure.
call the cake. And that's the view that you do a complete natural theology first, and then you add on top of it the icing of sacred doctrine. I don't think that's really what historically was intended or what was done, right? I mean, I think from a
Yeah.
apologetics point of view, if I was in a formal debate, say with an atheist philosopher, I would of course appeal first to arguments from reason. Why is that? Well, just because from a rhetorical and dialectical position, he's not going to share faith in Scripture with me, but he will
Yeah.
share, right? He should share the principles of causality and things of that nature.
Hmm.
So from a practical dialectical point of view, right, I might sometimes employ aspects of natural theology without explicitly speaking to sacred doctrine. But that's because of the circumstances in which, I would be operating. Historically, natural theology and sacred theology have been studied together, right,
Yeah.
as mutually informative. And, certainly with sacred theology being primary, and
Right.
natural theology being secondary. It's an instrument, it's a rule, right, that Christian theologians can use. Thomas says, not because there's anything lacking in sacred scripture, Thomas Aquinas,
Hmm.
um, but because there's something lacking in the students, right? And
Yeah.
that is that natural theology, in terms of because it uses terms and ideas that are open to reason, to natural reason, is something that is pedagogically effective, right, for
Yeah.
students, right? And so it's helpful and useful in that sense. It doesn't replace sacred scripture or sacred doctrine by any stretch, but it complements it.
Yeah. And I think that, what I think whether it's expressed this way or not, I think one of the biggest things within the human person is there is this deep seated need for consistency.
Sure.
If God's the God of everything,
Mm-hmm.
then I want theology to make sense. And
Mm-hmm.
or for me, that's the layman's term that I always just go back to. Does it
Mm-hmm.
make sense?
Yeah.
Do the things we teach in theology, follow, right?
Yeah. Sure.
We don't just want to kind of leave things to God's arbitrary will, or
Mm-hmm.
say that, or even say that God has this arbitrary will where the only reason why something is because God wills it to be.
Mm-hmm.
That there's no design, there's no it doesn't make any sense,
Right.
right? and
Right.
so
Yeah.
and so when we're studying our faith, we want to bring up things. Well, how can I understand? I already believe, but if somebody doesn't believe, how can I come to or what can I come to understand about the world around me? What can I come to
Sure.
understand just from looking at nature?
Sure. Yeah,
You know,
absolutely. Absolutely. And I think even as a believer, right, you might sort of say, okay, well, on the grounds of sacred scripture, I accept that God is the creator of the universe and he's providential and things of that nature.
yeah,
Um, but philosophy provides a lot of, I would say, resources
sure,
for as natural theology provides a lot of resources for the Christian to think those things through, right?
yeah,
And what we might say on the basis of sacred scripture, well, God is unchanging. That's true. Okay. Scripture tells us that and teaches us that. But why is God unchanging? What does it mean for
yeah,
God to be unchanging? How do we know that? What are the implications of the unchangingness of God? Well, that's, natural theology can provide the Christian with materials to think that through,
hmm,
and so, and that way, again, I think it's very useful. You would think about God's omnipotence,
yeah,
right? God's providential care of things. Well, I mean, again, you can just kind of have a imaginative picture of somebody, with a scepter giving decrees and angels going around and pushing cars over. But, I think that's probably not the best approach. I mean,
It sounds like it makes for good fiction. Sounds
it
like
does,
a great
right? Yeah. I think, whereas I certainly think angelic powers exist and that angelic powers are active, but I think that they're nestled within a broader system of causes. And again, philosophy can provide to, in a handmaiden-like way, provide to sacred theology ideas about causality, first and secondary causes, that can be used by the Christian theologian to articulate the ways in which God is provident, right? So it's not substituting scripture. Again, it's just a supplement to it. Does that make sense?
Can you? Yeah, it really does. Now set up the problem for us. Where does maybe some of the pushback from Christian theologians? Like, what is their kind of main beef with natural theology?
So this comes from a variety, really, of perspectives. One sort of slightly older version would be the kind of theology that comes out of Dutch Reformed theology in the 19th century, Dutch and German Reform, represented primarily by Cornelius van Til, who was active in America. He was influenced by Gerhardus Voss and, to a lesser extent, Herman Bavinck. They're interesting theologians in a lot of ways, but one of the things that Voss thought is that if the natural theology, and again, I just think he didn't understand Thomas on these points, but the natural theology compromises sacred theology because it makes God and the Bible subject to human reason. So that's one kind of objection. I'm just going to give a couple that are illustrative of the general thing. Another kind of objection would come from someone like Karl Barth, who wants to say that really that God is outside of our categories of experience to such a degree, right? That when God enters that experience, it's shattering, right, of the human condition, and that what theology does, what natural theology does, is reduce God to our category of being, and therefore take away the radical conversion that is supposed to take place when God enters our experience, right? So interestingly, sometimes, he uses the phrase that the analogy of being is antichrist, which is meant to be, rhetorically forceful. His way of understanding, Christian theology, sometimes he calls it Reformed theology. I would caution anyone to say it's not historical Reformed theology by any stretch. It's Reformed theology done through the lens of Heidegger and existentialism. Right. And so, he's taking those terms and, kind of translating traditional Reformed concepts into existentialist kind of language. Right. So the, for example, he'll talk about God as being purely actual. But what he means by that is God is really active. Right? He's going around and doing stuff all the time, right?
He's a busybody.
Exactly. Yeah, God, the busybody. So you have to be cautious there. But in the background is Heidegger, and Heidegger has a very influential. I think this is very influential on Karl Rahner. I think very influential on a large number of theologians. You see Karl Rahner, like, he turns natural theology away from its classical articulation as an objective philosophical science, right? It turns it towards really anthropology, right? Natural theology becomes the anthropological exploration of the needs and desires of the human person. Which
almost turns it into sociology, right?
That's right. Yeah. And what Heidegger has in view here is that what happened is that man, in his insecurities, right, before his anxiety about the temporality of his own being and the finitude of his own being, creates a concept of being that emphasizes permanence and presence.
Mhm.
And in doing so falls off from the authenticity of his own human condition, right, which is finitude. He takes that notion of permanence and extrapolates it out until he invents God, which is the ultimate guarantor of man's continued existence. And so
Yeah.
what you have is an onto being theology, but it's a theology of being in the sense that it's a theology entirely derived from our anxiety-ridden notion of being, right, that we
Yeah.
created in our own human condition. It's a really interesting view, right? One thing that's kind of interesting is Heidegger, went to Jesuit school and was in a
Right. Yeah. Okay.
just noting. And he wrote his dissertation. Who do you think he wrote his dissertation on? SCOTUS.
Who's
Yeah, causality, university of
we'll
being,
get to
all that stuff. But yeah, so
yeah.
anyways, that's kind of in the background of a lot of concerns, right? So that really, ontotheological critique of metaphysics can also become the ontotheological critique of theology, right?
Yeah.
Which is that really, what we're dealing with in natural theology is a kind of falsification, a kind of effort to dominate dominate our own condition, such that it's really it's almost kind of disrespectful of God and disrespectful of the human condition. And kind of not a respectable kind of enterprise,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's kind of dodgy and suspect to be involved in this kind of thing, right? Like what? And this is funny because I just taught a class at a fine university on medieval philosophy, and this was not a philosophy of God class. So we didn't focus on the classical demonstrations we got existence, but we did spend a couple weeks on it. And one of the students got really angry during the class, really I guess annoyed, I should say, not angry maybe, but really annoyed, and spoke up and said, why is he doing this? Like, why, if you believe, why all these arguments, which was really interesting, like, why would you be so frustrated, right? Of course, I tried to explain to him. I thought it grew out of the historical faith-seeking understanding project that you find, within the Christian tradition. He didn't seem to care for that. There is a strain. This is interesting, of both Christianity, but I've also found of people outside of Christianity who think that genuine religion must be romantic, must be mystical, right? And that if there's any intellectual kind of cognitive character to it, there's something kind of suspect about it, right? I mean, and I think Heidegger's kind of in that mode. I mean, Heidegger really, he's a phenomenologist, but he's coming out of the German intellectual background, which is heavily influenced by Schleiermacher and the various German idealists who really emphasize, right, that genuine religion is the feeling of dependence in your heart. And anything outside of that is falsification, So I think that's another strain, right? You get that kind of pushes against natural theology. Is that helpful?
Yeah, it is. And even in contemporary times, Christian Smith's term moral therapeutic deism, right? So even kind of that view is almost a and I use it air quotes here, romantic view of God, where God exists and he's good insofar as he motivates us to do the right thing or to do what is good. So it's based on a really kind of soft philosophy of God, one that's just squishy and just unsatisfying if you begin to really dive into, I think, a lot of these issues and say, my mind wants to make sense of these. I want to understand, the omnipotence with, with all of who God is and the basis of his creation around us, and also, how it relates to, maybe this is something we can get into, like this kind of right relationship with sacred theology and also the other branches of philosophy as well, right? There again, there's this, I think there's a real seeking for consistency with regards to all this, so maybe you can dive into some of that.
So I think we want to be clear that sacred theology is higher than natural theology, and there's a very good reason for that. It's not just a piety. Sacred theology is really shared theology, right? Thomas calls it the word just escaped me. It's like a subordinate science, right? Subordinate in this sense, it's subordinate to God's science of himself. So in sacred scripture, sacred scripture is God sharing his own self-knowledge of who and what he is and what he has done in history, right? So only God, right? I think subalternate science is what I was looking for. Only God it's only proper to God to know his own essence, right? And the contingent things that he decrees, right? So, all of the things that make up salvation history are in regards to God's essence contingent, right? God did not have to save mankind, right? God did not have to bring about the incarnation, all those sorts of things, right? The whole long, bizarre history of the people of Israel, right? All that sort of thing, right? Like that wasn't, strictly speaking, necessary in comparison to the divine essence. It was contingent. So God alone, right, is the one who knows those things, and he shares them with us in sacred scripture. So there, what we have is really a sharing of God's own mind, okay? With us. That's a higher light, obviously, right, than the light of natural reason, right? There we have the mind that is God, the light of God's own mind is the source of sacred theology, whereas the light involved in natural theology is the light of reason, which is an analog to the divine mind, a remote and imperfect sort of indication of the divine mind, but as a far lower one, right? So sacred theology is always higher than natural theology.
Now, what's the basis here? What's the basis here of natural theology?
So in if you think about sacred theology, its basis, right, is revelation and faith, right? Why do you believe that Isaac was the son of promise? Well, because God told me so, right? It's a perfectly adequate answer, actually. Now you might want to learn more things about why Isaac was the son of God, son of promise, right? And what that means. But that it is so, you could say scripture tells me that's why, right? God who can neither deceive nor be deceived has revealed it. But we don't have anything like that, right? With respect to natural theology, the light of natural reason is reason, intellect operating upon the objects of our experience, operating upon things with sensible qualities, operating upon interchangeable, contingent, composite, etc. Well, none of that's applicable to God. So then you sort of say, well, what is the basis for reason to explore God, right? And, one bad way of thinking about this would be to say, well, we can arrive at a concept of being that can be extended to eventually include God himself, right? There's an author named last name Lovejoy who wrote a book called The Great Chain of Being. It's very influential, unfortunately, on a lot of people and their understanding of medieval theology. I think it's a decent book, but it can also be very misleading in a lot of areas, especially with respect to Thomas Aquinas. There, the picture is, well, you have being and you abstract being more and you abstract being more. So you go from like quantitative, changeable, sensitive being, right? Or sensible being to
Yeah.
being that is just quantitative and sensible, to being that's just quantitative, to just being. And then you take being and you apply that to God. Now, there is a certain way in which that kind of abstraction is part of metaphysics. Okay.
Right.
But metaphysics and natural theology are not the same in Thomas's view, right? In metaphysics, we use a notion called ens commune, that we do abstract from ordinary experience to talk about being qua being, right? So one of the things that I used to love torturing philosophy majors with was, see them walking down the hall and say, hey, what is being qua being, right? What is ens qua ens? You're like, I don't know, Dr. Smith.
Nobody knows. Yeah.
That's the subject matter of metaphysics, properly speaking. Okay, that's not what we're doing in natural theology. What we're doing there is reaching up towards not the subject matter of metaphysics, but the cause of the subject matter.
Yeah.
Do you follow me there? Right. The subject matter is all this being, right? And all the kind of being that can be studied under ens commune, which includes immaterial being like intellectual being, the being of the angels, as well as sensible being. But it doesn't include God, right?
Yeah.
God is not part of the subject matter of metaphysics. Metaphysics is related to God insofar as God is the cause of the subject matter of metaphysics. Does that make sense?
Yeah. That distinction is very helpful in looking at or understanding that relationship between metaphysics and how, when we're looking at natural theology, we're not doing metaphysics, but again, we're going back to that. What's the causal relationship here?
That's right. Right. Yeah. So this is obviously natural theology sort of launches itself from metaphysics in a lot of ways, right?
Yeah.
It presupposes metaphysics, but it's really a science that's very analogous in nature, and it's one that's based on it's technical here, but based on an equivocal causal relation, or non-generic or non-univocal causal relationship. So this is
maybe you could go through that real quick. Univocal, equivocal, analogous, real quick.
So this gets the terminology gets a little difficult. All right, I'm just sorry. It's just this way it is. Okay.
But it's helpful. It's helpful.
It is. Yes. Yeah. Once you get it. So first thing we need to recognize, right, is that all of nature is compared to God as effect to cause, right? That's the relation that makes it possible for us to do natural theology. And the reason is that in any causal relationship, the effects in some way resemble the cause, right?
Right.
There is something about the effects that teaches you something about the cause, right? Indicates something about the cause. So insofar as all of nature is an effect of God, nature can resemble or teach us something about God, right? And that's really sort of the basis for doing natural theology. Now, that said, we don't apply. So that's kind of like the foundation. Now, one might say, see, well, Lovejoy and all those critics are correct because, well, then you're just going to be using natural categories and putting God under those natural categories and saying, see, like, Socrates is wise and God is wise and wisdom is the category. And we predicate that term wisdom of both subjects. But that's incorrect in terms of doing natural theology. And that's because we have different forms of predication, and those different forms of predication depend on different forms of causality. Right. So it's a little bit of a deep dive here.
Yeah, so by that we can say God is wise and Socrates is wise, but we mean completely different things. Like we're not saying those that Socrates is equal to God in wisdom or anything like that, or
Correct.
Socrates is wise in the same sense that we say God is wise.
Correct. Correct.
Right.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So the three forms of predication. So let me say this, what I mean by this word predication. Predication just means when you take a term and predicate it of a subject, say it of a subject, right?
Yeah.
So Jill runs. Jill is the subject. Runs is the predicate. We're predicating running of Jill. Okay, that's
right.
Grammatical point, but it's important, right?
Yeah.
And it's important that we can say one word of another in a variety of ways. We can predicate one term of another in a variety of ways. One way we can do that is univocally, and that's when we predicate the same term with the same meaning of different subjects. So there, for example, if I say the red ball and the red shirt, right? Red means the same in both subjects. That'd be univocal predication. Equivocal predication is when we use the same word but with a completely different meaning for two different subjects. So, for example, the wing of the house and the wing of a bird. We use the same term wing, but the meaning is radically different in both subjects, right?
And it's important here to not confuse equivocation and equivocal.
Yes,
right?
yeah. Equivocate, yeah. So the equivocation and equivocal are not the same thing as equivalent, right? That's what we have to watch out for.
Right, equivalent, right? Yeah. So even though it's equivocation, even though we're using the term equivocal, it doesn't mean equal.
That's right, exactly.
Right.
It means the opposite, which is so confusing.
Which is fun. This is what we do in philosophy,
That's
right?
That's right. And then finally, we have the analogous predication, and this is where we have the same meaning and a difference. Okay, so this is the analogy, sort of the mixture of the two. Okay.
Yeah.
And that's the way we can speak about God. We don't want to say that our language about God is totally equivocal, because then our affirmations about God are meaningless.
Yeah.
And so, but neither can we say they're univocal. Why is that? Again, that's not mere piety. It's the fact that God transcends all of our categories. And we know that, right? Because God is immutable, because God is a necessary being and everything else is contingent being, right? We could go on, right? So there's a qualitative difference, not a difference in degree.
Right.
Between God and every other being, such that God cannot be included under any of the categories of being that we develop within our experience. Now, as I say, under, right? There's no genus that God fits under, okay? Even being, right? If being were a genus, which is not, but even if you were to say being was a genus, right? That God doesn't fit under that category either, okay? The best we can do is, so it starts to sound like either you have to say God fits under a creaturely category, and then we have a univocal science of God, or that God doesn't fit under any category, and therefore we have no science of God, right?
Right.
And we want to say both are false, but what we can achieve is an analogous science of God based on the causal relationship that obtains between creatures and God. Does that make a little bit of sense?
Yeah. So with the and I think most people are going to be familiar with just, the using analogies that while we're getting at something that is true, we're pointing to maybe, something that we can say positively about something. There's our example, or our predication here is going to be just completely lacking. Right. I mean, look at any sort of analogy of the Trinity, right? Right. The Trinity is not like an egg. The Trinity is not like a shamrock. Like, in reality,
water.
Right. Water. I mean, like, go on and on and on. Yeah. Come on, Patrick. Like, it's every analogy we use for the Trinity is wholly lacking. But they can, the analogies can give us a glimpse at an aspect to where that gives our mind something to grasp that is true, while at the same time, and this is the point of the analogy, right? While at the same time remaining just wholly different, right?
Sure. Yeah. So the kind of technical, so there's a long debate about various forms of analogy within natural theology, within metaphysics in general. The form that the approach that I take that I think is the most useful is to think about the analogy of attribution. And this is where you predicate a term of a primary instance and then of secondary instances in relation to the primary instance.
All right, give me an example of that one.
All right, so this is going to be a little bit of a weird example, but it's helpful. It's the stock example. So in the ancient world, you could say healthy of three different things. You could say healthy of a body, healthy of medicine, and then oddly enough, healthy of urine, right? The idea was that some samples of urine indicate a healthy body and other samples of urine indicate an unhealthy body. Okay. Now we might think, well, that's kind of weird, but you think about it, you take a blood test, and you can say, hey, that's a healthy sample and that's an unhealthy sample, right? We have a more sophisticated understanding of that, but you're kind of getting at the sort of the same underlying sort of structure. So what's the primary instance? So we're going to play a game here, Jason. What's the primary instance of health? Is it the body? Is it the healthy body? Is it the healthy medicine? Or is it the healthy urine?
Yeah, the 5-year-old boy in me wants to immediately go in one direction. So I'm going to say the body.
That's right. Yeah. Health is primarily side of the body, right? Yeah. We understand healthy medicine and healthy urine in relationship to healthy body. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that's why it makes sense. We can say something like, a given medicine is healthy. You might say, really? Like, how's the medicine healthy? It's a pill. It can't be healthy. It can't live or die. It can't function well or not. Right? What are you talking about? Right? But it makes sense to call it healthy because it's the cause of health in the body. Or you could say with the urine example, the way Thomas and Eric talk about it is, it's an effect. It's a sign of a healthy body. Right. So it could make sense of attributing health in these other ways because of the main instance where we say health of the body. Thomas uses this way of talking about analogy with respect to the categories of being. So we're talking about substance and the accidental categories. The accidental categories are called being because of their relationship to substance, right? So, we'd say location is called being because location is something that may be said of substance, right? Things of that nature. So in terms of God, right, the primary, if we're focusing on, just for the sake of brevity here, the proper perfections, if we're focusing on those, right, when we say wisdom, we actually attribute wisdom primarily to God and secondarily to Socrates, right? We attribute justice primarily to God and secondarily to Solomon, right? So those are why is that? Because God is the fullest, purest instantiation of every perfection, right? And undividedly so. So when we say Socrates is wise and God is wise, really what we're saying is that wisdom, right, in Socrates, which is an effect of God, is that wisdom is something like God. That wisdom is an indication of God. That wisdom is a remote and imperfect resemblance of the undivided perfection that is God in himself, right? Now, the causal relationship that helps us to understand that. So you see how that goes, that direction. It's what we experience is said to be a likeness of God, not, right, that God is a likeness of what we experience.
Yeah. And I think what you said earlier is helpful as well to remember here with regards to degree, right? We're not saying that, God is just a higher degree of wise,
correct,
than Solomon or somebody like that, or Socrates, right? That That's it's right. but but we're looking at the effect,
Mhm.
and we're moving up towards the cause of that effect.
That's right. That's right.
Not saying, that, God is the highest effect, because that's essentially what we would be saying, right?
Yeah.
Right? We
Right.
never, right? Yeah, you fall into real sorts of problems.
Right.
But to go from the effect back to the cause.
That's right. That's right. And that allows us to say, look, I'm not trying to include God under my category of wisdom,
Right.
right? I'm saying my category of wisdom at best is a remote and imperfect likeness of God. Does that make
Yeah.
sense? See, that's
Yeah.
not a generic, like, here I've got a genus, here's wisdom, and then there's God and Socrates underneath that genus. That's not what I'm doing here, and that's not
Yeah.
what
Yeah.
we're doing in natural theology, right? We are doing a kind of theology that is, you might say, semiotic in a way, right? That is, it's a
Sure.
sign theology. It's a theology where we're dealing with um, creaturely perfections as signs of God, right? But not as categories that capture the essence of God.
Right. And to even say that, my wisdom is, and my experience of wisdom, or my experience of whatever it is we're talking about, is, finds its fulfillment, is an image of what God is, or who God is, but my experience of it is caused by God,
Uh-huh.
and is wholly and entirely imperfect.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
even though I have an experience of this wisdom, I will never, get
Yeah.
at the wisdom, what real wisdom is in God.
That's
Or
right. Yeah. Not in its fullness, not in its comprehension. And you don't want to say,
yeah,
like, that God's wisdom, or God and my wisdom, or Socrates' wisdom is on a continuum, right? Rather, it's as different as the image of a man and the man himself,
yeah, yeah,
right? Those are two different categories, right? If you think about it, right? They're categorically different. Here's a human being with virtues and vices and nutritive powers and arts and sciences and all this sort of thing, and relations, etc. And then here's a picture, and it has none of that.
yeah,
Right? At best, it has sensible qualities. So these are categorically different kinds of things, right? And I think that, man, that Tom is just right on the money here, and
yeah,
finding the thin balance point here, which is thin, but it's there, right? That we can talk about God in natural theology, because without compromising his transcendence, or without
mhm,
falling into pure apophatism, we
mhm,
can do that because of a causal relation that allows us to talk about creatures as analogous, imperfect, and remote signs of God. Right?
yeah,
Does that make sense?
yeah. That's helpful. Yeah,
Good.
and I think, and again, as difficult, I think, as, doing the mental exercises of it, of going through kind of this kind of thought process and things, it again, it goes back to, I think, that desire of, it makes sense, right?
Sure, sure.
There's a consistency that we want to see, where, okay, if because even I think at the basis, right, God has revealed all these things in nature, God has supernaturally revealed all these things,
Mhm.
but if I can't really talk about it in any intelligent way,
Right. That
like,
doesn't help.
there, yeah, yeah, there's, it it's just, it's dissatisfying, and it's
Mhm.
yeah, it again, it points to something, lacking in us, obviously.
Sure.
um
Can I go just a
yeah, yeah,
little bit further here? I know we've gone long here, but I
no,
just
it's good.
complete this project just a little bit, that or this topic, um, that relationship of analogy that we've been talking about, right?
Yeah.
This analogy of attribution, and applying and thinking about creaturely perfections as signs of God. Um, that's ultimately rooted in this, what I mentioned before, which is that non-univocal causal relation. Um,
Yeah.
and there, yeah, actually, that's a very technical sounding thing, but it makes a lot of sense. I'll give you two examples. And this is important. Why is it important? It's important because our ability to speak about God naturally is dependent upon the causal relation, right?
Yeah.
If it wasn't for that causal relation, we would have no natural way of talking about God, right?
Right.
So then we need to think about, well, what kind of causal relation is at stake here? Okay.
Yeah.
And Thomas distinguishes between univocal causal relations and non-univocal causal relations. Univocal causal relations are when a man begets a son. A man begets a son. Well, the man is the cause, along with the mother, of the son. Well, they're both human beings, right? They're both Homo sapiens, right?
Yeah.
And the offspring is a Homo sapien. They're all within the same genus, right? And therefore, we can say human of the father, human of the mother, and human of the son. And human is the same thing, right? Does that make sense? There's a univocal predication. It's a univocal predication based on a univocal causal relation, right?
Right.
They're all operating within the same genus. There are other causes, though, in which we have a non-univocal causal relationship. That is a causal relationship that's super generic, right? In which the cause transcends the genus of the effect. Let me say that again. Okay.
Yeah, say it again.
Right. A non-univocal causal relationship is one in which the cause transcends the genus of the effect. Okay. So that means it's operating outside of the category of the effect. The stock example that's used here is the way in which the sun is the cause of plant life. Clearly the sun sun is not a plant. It's outside of the genus of plant, clearly, right? I mean, I don't understand a whole lot about the sun, but it's like a gigantic nuclear explosion or something going on and on, right? It's it's not plant life, and yet it's the cause of life in plants. Isn't that interesting, right? And so what we would say there is we can learn something about the sun from plants, right? But it's very remote. It's very imperfect. And that's because what we have here is a cause that transcends the category of the plant. And what's really key in replying to, I think, the critics of natural theology is to recognize that the category of plant life is not, in this instance, how we would learn about the sun, right?
Right.
We don't pull the sun down into the category of plant life. That makes zero sense to do, right? What we have here is a cause that transcends the category that we know. We take that category and from it extrapolate some things about the cause, right? But we don't do that by applying the category of plant to the sun, right? And it's completely the same when we're thinking about applying creaturely categories to God. God's effects in creaturely perfections can indicate to us something about God, but we clearly don't drag the transcendent uncaused cause down into our creaturely categories in order to learn about it, right? In doing so, we would falsify everything we had to say about the uncaused cause.
So correct me if this is not a correct summary. So when we're doing natural theology, we're not getting where the goal of it is not to get at the essence of God or anything like that, right? Like we're not going to get at God's inner life or anything like that, right? It's not we're not looking at God as kind of this subject matter in this way, but like studying plants to learn something about the sun.
That's right.
You can know something, but you're not going to get at the essence of the sun by studying plants.
That's right.
But you'll understand again the focus being that causal relation.
That's right. And even what we do learn about God from his effects, right, is not on the basis of having some concept that captures God or reduces God to creaturely categories. Rather, what we learn about God from his effects is entirely has to do with the way in which the effects depend upon God.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And that's a helpful way to I think, make that distinction so that, we don't fall into the trap of saying, well, we're just kind of natural theology. We don't want to reduce natural theology to just rationalism or something like that, or anything like that, or saying it's essentially useless. No, I mean we can know something, and there's deep meaning in nature. I think that's the other thing that I think is helpful to remember, that everything that God created, which is everything, right, is filled with meaning and purpose, right?
That's right.
And God is the cause of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Let's explore that relationship. Let's explore and see if we can understand something about about who God is from this, while at the same time knowing and understanding that we're not going to get at his essence, right?
That's right. Absolutely.
So it's a wholly unfulfilling project. So great.
It's not wholly unfulfilling.
Okay.
That's right. It's useful, right? It's useful.
It's very useful.
I think you can think about it in terms of just your own intellectual development. It provides you with ways of thinking about God when you're in prayer. It provides you, the Christian theologian, with resources for talking about things like providence, things of that nature. It does not, and I think this is right on. It does not give us quantitative knowledge of God. And if if that's what you're looking for in philosophy, you're looking in the wrong place, right? Philosophy is a handmaiden, and she can serve well, but you shouldn't expect more of her than what she can actually provide.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that it does, or at least for me, is, it gives you a bigger view of all of creation. And what I mean by, and why I think that's important is because I think many times in Christianity we can fall into a kind of just a spiritualism where it almost falls into like some dualism where essentially to hell with the created world and even my body. I'm going to focus on my spirit, and my spirituality and all these things. Well, no, I mean, because it's not us being made in the image and likeness of God, right? That's not reflective of who God is, right? He didn't just create the world just to have something to play with. It's not like a little kid in Play-Doh, where he just creates something just to destroy it. But no, he's placed meaning and purpose and again, there's something that is revealing about nature itself that we can come to understand a little bit about the creator, right? Not in his essence, but we can understand a little bit about his creator. So, like you said, it elevates the mind. It can refute, right, agnosticism, and like you said as well, provide theology with those useful analogies.
That's right.
Awesome. Well, Dr. Smith, I think you've given our listeners a lot to think about here, and I think it should be refreshing, right? I think to Christians, right, that we don't want to just simply reduce our rational thinking to just matters of the world, and we don't just want to reduce our theological exploration to just spiritual matters, but to understand a more full picture of creation, of nature, of who we are, of what the world is, and God's plan of salvation and how it all fits together. And so I want to invite all our listeners, head over to CatholicStudiesAcademy.com, check out all of our content over there. And if you're so inclined, which I hope you are after this podcast, to sign up for some courses. And again, to begin to take that intellectual journey, to dive deeper into these things. Because I could say from just my own personal experience, it's like swimming when you're a kid. You dive in once and it's awesome. And then what do you have to do? You got to do it over and over and over again. It's so much fun. I love and I enjoy, and I get so much after diving into these subjects, waiting a little bit, letting it marinate, dive back into these subjects and explore them a little bit more and go deeper and deeper into them. So I just want to invite all our listeners, check out all of our content over there. And in the meantime, God bless.